Hello everyone and welcome to the portrait evaluation. Let's jump right in with a lovely photo from Yohan Beeri, and we have a portrait of someone who, judging by that look, he knows. And from a portrait perspective, there's a lot of things that are really going correctly here. One of them is the framing is really well done. The photo having a blurry background is really well done, and the way that the light and dark, by the way, in the background here work together, absolutely lovely. It creates this really interesting background that because of the relative smoothness of the person's face and the brightness of the person's hat, really set it apart. What I mean by that is it makes the subject, the person, really stand apart from the background. This is a really good use of a blurry background for a portrait. So the overall, like I said, the image structure and composition are really working well. I think the pose is interesting. Her look is interesting and engaging. Like having the person look at the camera in a setup photo like this, generally a good idea, because it then forces the viewer to make eye contact with the subject. So all of those things are going really well. The couple of things I'd note here is your focus point is her right shoulder and the fabric on her shoulder, and her eye is beyond, is in the back of, is to the back of the plane of sharpest focus here. And that just stands out because of the texture of her denim shirt. If you imagine that instead of a denim shirt, she'd just been wearing a satin blouse, like just to pick a fabric, right? Then the smoothness of that fabric would have masked that the photo, that the plane of sharpest focus was her shoulder, and then the entire photo would have appeared as a soft focus portrait. Just a thing to think about with the textures. And then I'm going to guess, by the way, again, that this is one of those cases where you would manually focus the lens, and then at the very minute taking the photo, had a little bit of shake, either, when you press the trigger. I'm assuming this looks like probably a 6x6, either a TLR or a 6x6 SLR. And when you put those, most of those have the trigger on the front of the camera. So it's really easy to push the trigger down and at the same time kind of shift the camera back a little bit. So if your focus point was her eye when you focused and you did that, you pushed the camera back a little bit taking the photo, that would pull the focus point toward her shoulder. So just a thing to notice there. But other than that, that, aside from that one little thing, there is so much that is a good instinct in the way that this photo is structured. It's really well done. Our next photo comes from Steve Boyce, and this is a photo that would have definitely been taken at one of the Gaza protests here. This is a really good example of how to isolate a subject in a chaotic background. So I think it was Steve Boyce who sent in the photo of the traffic cop as well, where I said that is an example of how focus and depth of field should be used. Same thing's going on here, right? We have everything from the subject's left shoulder fabric to just beyond her nose. You can see her right eye's eyelashes are in focus. That's the plane of focus. Then you get to the sign beyond her. That's blurry, and the people beyond are blurry as well. So the subject isolation here and the use of depth of field is spot on, enviably good. I think also the use of tone, gray shirt, black. Is that a hijab? I should know these things. I have an international audience. Then also the fact that those are both grayscale, right? And then you've got the color of her face, right? That's just a really good use of setting color next to grayscale as well. And because of that, the color of her face next to the grayscale, that's a thing that really draws our eyes to the subject's face and really causes some engagement. So this is an example where the subject doesn't have to be looking at the photo for the viewer to be engaged with the photo because of the way that those elements are working together. Our next photo comes from Robert Thompson, and we have a fun photo of the subject holding a spoon up in front of her nose a little bit, Just remember, there is no spoon. From a technical perspective, like there's a ton here that's really going well. Focus is precise. It is exactly where it should be, on her eyes. And the depth of field is nice and shallow. You got everything from the front of her cheeks to the back of her eyebrows in focus. Like for a very shallow depth of field image, a portrait image, like this is what you want to have happen. The overall image structure is really good. You can tell that this is probably like at a kitchen table during breakfast or something. And so the image not just being technically really spot on, it also conveys a sense of place and time. And also, because like we talked about in both of the last images, because the subject is looking right at the camera, forces engagement with the viewer. So overall, framing works really well. And I think that this is a pretty darn good execution of a shallow focus portrait photo. It was very well done. And this is something I think you're going to hear me say a lot this video. This was very well done. Our next photo comes from Rich Mander, and this was one when I looked at the thumbnails, I'm like, ooh, I'm going to double check this photo because that is looking really good. The pose here, the colors, like especially like the fact that really the only blue is in the subject's eyes, like really stands out. Like if the subject's eyes had been in sharp focus, this probably would have been the second place photo for this year, because that would have been such an engaging photo. But unfortunately, the plane of sharpest focus ended up being the tip of your subject's nose, which is, generally speaking, from a portrait photography standpoint, not where you want to have the focus be. This photo breaks a lot of the rules that we just talked about in the last three images and that we've talked about throughout. So let's imagine this photo in our minds where the subject's eyes are in sharp focus and we're engaged with those. We're looking at them. And the subject is not looking at us. He's kind of facing us, but he's looking off to the side. And and if we did the exact same thing, we'd be looking at this big negative color field space on the right side of the image. So if we had the same eye orientation as he did. And so that forces us to ask, why? Like, what is the story behind this image? Is this someone who's being wistful or sad or staring off to the distance in deep thought? Or is this somebody who's staring off into the distance away from the viewer because they don't want to engage with the viewer? What is that reason? And so this structure of this image creates a whole lot of potential for the image to leave a lot of room for interpretation about what a story could be for the viewer. And I think that there's a lot of things here that are really spot on with the inclination for all of that. Next up, from Richard Mengle, we have a photo of sheep. Looks like a sheep standing in a barn, and really fun photo, really enjoyable. Sheep are adorable anyway. At any rate, one of the things here that's working out really well is the use of color and texture. So we have this white and black sheep. And so the sheep's the only thing in the photo that's like black and white. There's a little bit of yellow on the fur, but it's really functionally devoid of color information. We have the texture of the open door, the inside of it, and then this bright red and white of the closed door to the left of it. And so the texture and the colors become a little bit to an extent a distracting element, because our eyes want to go to the red and then our eyes want to go to that texture. And like in the process, we go towards the sheep, but it's not as dominant an element of the photo as the previous four photos that we saw in terms of a portrait subject. So it is interesting to see a photo here so far. This is the first entry we have where it's a portrait subject of a portrait photo of a subject in that subject's environment, an environmental photo. And so anyway, that's something I think we have a few more of. One thing to think about with this is if you look at the verticals, they're a little bit slanted off to the left. So if you recropped for that door, either the interior angle there or the vertical on the red and white door to be vertical, see how that would take a look at, or how that would adjust the photo, and that might make it feel a little bit more balanced, because right now the angle of those lines is making the photo feel a little bit imbalanced as well. Some things that are really working well here: you can't always get animals to engage with a portrait photo, but the sheep is definitely looking right at the camera. It's curious, like its expression says curiosity, and so that's going to be something that will engage with the viewers when they see this photo. And I think those are some things that are really done well and not necessarily easy to execute. Our next photo comes from Gemista, and this is a portrait photo. And I think, if I remember your notes correctly, you said that this was taken on a 4x5 camera as well, with an older lens, and so a little bit of soft focus. And this is a really neat use of soft focus. Soft focus lenses, whether they're specifically soft focus lenses or just ones that are soft when they're wide open, were really sought after by portrait photographers, because that softness in the image would actually, the way that soft focus works is, it's not, if you think of a traditional sharp lens, one that renders really well, is focusing an infinite number of beams of light in sharp point focus on a film plane, it creates one sharp image. A soft focus lens there's a couple of different ways they can work. They can either have like a flaw with the lens, like haze or something like that. They can have an adjustment that throws one of the elements out of alignment intentionally to different degrees to increase or decrease softness, or they can have a soft focus Waterhouse aperture, which looks basically like Swiss cheese. And what that does is that creates a sharp image with multiple soft images overlaid onto it, all focused on the exact same point, which takes that sharp image and creates a soft glow in it. This photo looks like it's probably a lens that's soft, wide open, and maybe has a little bit of age-related haze in it. But the point of all of that tangent was that soft focus lenses are a really good lens to use for portraits, because they create a more flattering look. They hide any sort of wrinkles, blemishes, or anything like that people have that they may not like having in sharp rendition. And also, they create portraits which convey a sense of emotion more than technical accuracy. And oftentimes, when we're talking about portrait photos, technical accuracy can put us in the moment, but softness like this, a lack of technical accuracy, can put us into an emotional reaction in the photo. And so that's one of the things that's going on here, is that this is a sort of photo that feels like a happy memory. Like we've got the subject smiling at the camera, and that has that sort of softness which feels like memory haze. So it could very easily be that this photo was one that is something that is in our minds. And I think it achieves that look very well. This photo comes from Mukul, and really clever take on how to do a portrait. It looks like a self-portrait here, and taken at a broken piece of glass or a broken mirror here. And so you end up with, I think, choosing the part of the broken mirror here that was chosen for this photo works really well, because you end up with these like repeated patterns of the photographer and the person that they're standing next to in this broken mirror. And then whatever overhead lighting is above them is repeated. And it gives a sense of like there's order, because it's these two guys taking a photo together. And there's order in the lines that are all horizontal going across them, the photo rather. But there's also this chaos in the way that this mirror is broken. And it feels like looking out at a scene from the other side of the mirror at these two guys. And this was a truly captivating photo. and one that was unlike anything I've seen in all of the times I've done portrait or related types of entries for the contest on this channel. From Milan Cetic, we have this black and white photo of a person, and I am not sure what's going on with her eyes. Is this like a long exposure where she blinked? It looks, that's gotta be it. She's gotta be blinking. At first it looked like I couldn't tell if she was wearing white contacts or something like that. Anyway, I do really like the structure of this photo and the way that the background is dark and the subject is lit, and the way that the subject is posed. One of the things that's really going on well here that's interesting, and there weren't too many photos in this category that did this, was the way that the light is really harsh, and it's casting these shadows on her face. So you can see the shadow that's sort of like triangular hook-shaped from her nose, another one coming off of her lips, and then another one that forms halfway over her eye and then blends into the shadow on the side of her face. And so the use of this harsh light in this shadow contributes to showing the shape of the subject's face, but it also becomes in and of itself a part of the subject. And so it's a complementing factor, and it's its own thing within the photo. Also, I really think the use of like slightly missed focus here is actually kind of working really nicely. You can see whatever she's holding in her hand is in sharp focus. So if we imagine this photo with that removed, now the whole photo would just become this soft focus image. And it right now feels like the focus was not intentional, because this thing that she's holding that has all the texture is in focus. So if that wasn't there, it would feel like the soft focus was absolutely an intentional element in the photo. So, but other than that, I think a lot of the things going on with structure, composition, lighting, use of darkness, soft focus in the background, the way that the background is blurry, and then the subject isolation because of that blurry background are all done really well with this photo. From Luca Pasini, we have a really interesting use of color in this portrait of the guitarist here. And so this is a really nice environmental photo. You know, an environmental photo portrait being one that shows a subject in its environment where it belongs. And this is clearly like some music gig, and he's probably playing with a band. Either this is a practice or, actually judging by the posters on the right side, probably an actual show. And so he's really focused, and that's an engaging thing because for us as a viewer, because what he's focused on, now that becomes what we're focused on. And that's reinforced by the guitar being cast in red light. And so red is a color, red, yellow, orange, and red are colors that our eyes are drawn to really well. And so we have this yellow symbol over there transitioning into a little bit of orange and then to the red. And so it's a natural progression for our eyes to follow. And then we have the guitarist whose face is cast in red, and he is looking down at the guitar as well. Everything behind him is green, and so that's opposite of red on the color spectrum, and so it's both complementary and then isolating from the red cast of the guitar. So I think really good use here of all of that, of the way, really good use here of color to emphasize the subject and complement the scene that's being photographed. Next up, from Ken Andersson, we have quite a playful photo of someone holding two flowers up to their eyes. And honestly, really a ton of fun for this portrait and very well executed. I think the use of film grain here does quite a lot for the photo as well, because it adds this really nice visual texture that's very complementary to both the person and the flowers that she's holding up in front of her face. And I think that the medium here is working really well to go along with the photo. So, I mean, if you could go back and redo this pose, the only thing I could think of to think about a little bit differently would be get lower, because right now she's sort of looking up and you're pointing the camera down. And the detraction to that is, if you look in the bottom left, the background, you can see where the wall of the house transitions. But if you got a little bit lower and just a little bit closer, then you would isolate her more. She'd become a bigger part of the photo, a more dominant, a larger percentage of the negative space. And then the plants behind her would become the background. And I think that this is one of those cases where having the plants not be super blurry, but having some of them be in sharp focus and some be somewhat blurry is a really good use of that, because she has taken 2 of the flowers off of those plants and is posing for a playful photo with these. And this is one of the things that there weren't too many photos this year that were like playful. And so it was really nice to see one of these that a photo that was like, I'm going to have fun here. So really, really good instinct and well executed in that regard. From Joshua Gaude, we have a photo of his, we would assume his pet dog or someone's pet dog, lounging in the sun on a padded bench. And really absolutely cute photo. So we have here that we're going to hone right in on one of the technical issues. A lot of autofocuses, and I'm not sure if this camera uses autofocus or not, will hone in on dogs' noses instead of their eyes. And that is less true with the newest generation of mirrorless cameras, which have animal eye focus algorithms. But older cameras that used autofocus which sought out contrast would be more drawn to a dog's nose, because it had lots of, because they're wet and shiny and they have specular highlights in the texture of the dog's nose skin. And so the focus point here is actually the dog's nose and whiskers. And then by the time we get to the dog's eye, it's out of focus. So focus is just a little bit too far forward in this photo. But the overall image composition is really good, because the image conveys a sense of the place, and the dog's like kind of lounging. It's looking off to the side. There's something over there that's interesting, kind of wonder what it is. The use of color, where you have this warm tone fur to the dog with the cool tone color of the padding, really complement each other very nicely. And then the other thing is, like, the exposure is generally pretty darn good. There's a little bit of highlight clipping on the dog's cheek, but other than that, you get the use of exposure here gives you a lot of color gradation within the dog's fur. You have the dark reds, the light reds, the tans, the blacks, and things like that, and it really creates a dynamic overall look to the dog. One other thing I might look at is the dog's tag. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to kind of just like clone out the numbering and the wording on tags. This looks like it's just a rabies vaccination, but if you're out photographing dogs and you're going to post the photos online, high resolution, especially digital cameras now, can record people's personal information off dog tags. And so it's a good habit to get into, just kind of clone those out, because one, lettering can become a distracting element, and also you don't necessarily want to have your phone number or something like that from your dog's tag displayed for the internet to see. So at any rate, that being a rabies vaccination, it's not going to have any personal information, but just one thing to think about as a general best practice for photographing dogs when their tags are in the photos. From Joseph Schallmo, we have we'll call this a portrait because the photographer is clearly in it. And it's curious because obviously this is not a self-portrait, unless he brought a mirror out to whatever field this is. I think this is a really nice way of doing an environmental portrait, because we don't know who the photographer is, but we know what they're doing. They're going to take a picture of whatever landscape is behind them. Can't really tell by the reflection in the lens what it is. It's because we can see the other photographer holding his camera in it. But yeah, I think it's also a really nice structure, and with the photographer and the camera being right there in the middle. And then you have the like softness of the different fabrics that the photographer is wearing against the harsh and straight lines of the tripod and the camera, which are rigid and fixed. And so there's this really nice textural point counterpoint going on between the photographer and the camera. And there's also this uniformity of color family, because we have these browns and greens in the background, browns and greens in the tripod, the camera, and the coat, and then a little bit of blue and gray hinted at both in the sky and the scarf and the shirt. So a really nice overall pleasing color palette throughout the photo as well. And for those of you curious, Schneider 21 centimeter f4.5 and a compound shutter, really nice large format lens. Good choice on that. So anyway, yeah, really good portrait of a photographer. And I'm not the person under that dark cloth, but if I were, I think I'd be pretty happy with that result. From Jaeyon Lee, we have these two photos of the dogs up at the baby gate, either looking at a rabbit and wanting to go out, or just very excited that someone is home. This is an interesting thing here that we've seen from Jaeyon is there's this like uniformity of photographic voice across his photos. So I think this one really is reminiscent of that green building photo we saw in the architecture, where it was the picture of the storefront. Because here again, we have that sort of like rectangular building structure. And even though, yes, they're on a patio and the patio goes backwards a little bit, it's more of a generally flat sort of photo. And that's something that a lot of photographers don't develop, is this uniformity of voice across work, or uniformity of voice across projects, over various projects over the course of a career, or within projects individually. So, the point that I want to hammer home about that is that as you look at your own work, start to evaluate it, to look at what things are you doing similarly, and don't just do that. See how you can do things that are different, but also see those things that you're doing similarly. What are the strengths that those similarities across your work bring to your photos, and become a little bit evaluative of your image structure and that as you become more conscious of the way that you are drawn to image structure, you can then use that to find subjects that will complement your natural inclination. Or you can become aware of when you do it for subjects that could maybe benefit from other structures. This is one I think really works with the same structure that we've seen from Jaeyon throughout the course of these photos so far. And I think it's a really good thing to have that consistent voice when you do work across multiple photos. From David Higgins, we have a portrait of, probably assume his daughter, but a young girl, right? And so one of the things we'll look at right away, which our eyes are going to be drawn to right away, which we've seen in many of the photos so far, the texture of her shirt sleeve. The fabric there is in sharp focus. Her eyes are behind the plane of softest focus. Beyond that, super cute photo, really absolutely adorable. That would just be the first thing I'd point out, because generally speaking, our eyes are going to be drawn to that, either something that's very light or very dark, or more commonly in sharp focus when the rest of the scene has various levels of out of focusness in them. I think the pose is really nice, really spur of the moment and adorable. So I think there's a lot of things here that are going really well. One thing to look at might be, this is right now 2:3, looks like about a 2:3 aspect, maybe a 5:7 aspect ratio. What if this same photo, if you could take something like this again, but in a crop, get a little bit tighter and make it a 4:5 aspect ratio, and then that way you'd lose a little bit of the background, which is fine, and then the girl would fill up more of the overall frame. Just something to think about whenever you get a chance to take a photo again. Next, our next photo comes from Clay Williams, and we have here a really nice use of light and shadow again, and really pretty much spot on, actually not pretty much, just exactly spot on, plane of sharpest focus on the subject's face, and a really interesting and captivating expression. Like, we can tell he's frowning, but it's a happy frown. So hard to, probably somebody who's didn't expect to have their photo taken at that moment, or something like that. It's a it's a fun, a welcoming, and sort of a playful expression that is definitely engaging with the viewer here. I think also the bird sitting on the roof is an unexpectedly pleasant element of this photo as well. So if there were something to look at, think about if you could get the camera a little bit closer. If you had the opportunity to photograph this guy again, and you got the camera just a little bit closer here, the lighting, like realistically, this lighting is absolutely spot on. So if you could replicate that lighting with the photo, the bottom of the photo being maybe where the middle of his biceps are right now, just by physically moving yourself, that could be a really good way to amplify the lighting use in here and to make your subject a more dominant part of the image. From Brendan, we have a photo of someone whose expression indicates that they likely know each other fairly well, and a very up-close photo. This is a great example of getting really close to your subject and taking a portrait photo of your subject where they really are like dominating the scene. Really good use of the full range of contrast as well. We have very dark over on the right and down on the left and to the left side as well. And that forces us, as well as the natural inclination that we're going to have to look toward a bright part of the scene, to focus on the subject's face. So if you'll think back to the very first photo we looked at with the denim jacket in that photo as well, the plane of sharpest focus is across her shoulders. And because of the texture of her denim jacket, that sharpness in the fabric and the weave really jumps right out of the photo. And then when we look at her face and we can see that the focus point in the eyes is a little bit missed, then that can affect our perception of the photo. What's interesting is part of what's going on with the eyes as well, by the way, is the glasses. So glasses are lenses, just like we'd put in front of our cameras, but they adjust the diopter of our eyes, and they are designed to change the focus of the light reaching our eyes so that it's then properly aligned. So that has an effect on how our cameras focus. So one of the things that's interesting here is that it looks like her eyebrows above her glasses might actually be in pretty close to perfect focus, which would mean that her eyes should then, in theory, be pretty darn spot on. When I photograph people with glasses, whatever camera I'm using, if it's not manual focus, I will switch it over to manual focus, and then use manual focus to get into to focus on their eyes, because glasses will throw off the focus point of a modern autofocus system. Now, this is a film photo, so that doesn't necessarily apply. That's a tip just for digital camera shooters. But one thing when you're photographing a person who has glasses, if you either ask them to take their glasses off, or if they don't want to, or you like the photo with their glasses on, then make sure that you are looking at their eye to focus for that. And yes, maybe the rest of their face will be a little bit out of focus because the glasses will change the focus point of their eyes. But then the thing that people are going to be most engaging with, which is the subject's eyes, will be in sharp focus. So just a thing to think about there. And actually, the more that I look at this, the more I think that her face actually is in sharp focus, as well as her shoulders. It's just the glasses have thrown off the focus point of her eyes on as the light traveled through the lens of the camera. From BlueMoonKissLove, we have a portrait of a hornet or a wasp. I'm assuming like it's on the other side of a pane of glass here. And so really, this is the only macro portrait we got. And I think this is a really neat way to show this type of subject. And there's a lot of really interesting detail in this insect. You can see the dots in the compound eyes. You can see a whole lot of color variation across the wasp or the hornet's body and legs. And that color complements the blurriness of the out of focus background as well. So really like a lot of the ways that this photo is working. center framing a subject like well, any of the portraits really, but center framing a shot like this is really a nice way to structure an insect macro photo as well. So, but let me real quickly return to and hammer again on the use of color here, because one of the really neat things is that the red tones, yellow tones of this wasp are right in front of whatever that blue or dark gray aspect of the background is, whatever that ultra blurry thing back there is. And so that amplifies the warmness of the color tones within the insect's body. And it's a really good instinct there for the photographer, for BlueMoonKissLove, to take the camera and like have that darker, cool tone blob in the background to amplify the colors in the insect. So nicely done on that. From Andrej Bjelakovic, we have a photo of someone taking a shot of what is almost certainly an extremely strong spirit. So I really think, so there's a lot of things here that are going on that are really good. And I like the pose. I like how casual this photo is. This is not a person who is putting on any sort of like anything for the camera. This is who that person is, and they are happy if we know it, and they're happy if we don't. And they're going to go on with their life anyway. So I really love the structure, the composition, the overall use of the subject here. The only thing I would point out from a technical issue is that the subject's right eye is in focus, not the left. And as a good rule of structuring portrait photos, if the dominant eye is in focus, then it's going to be a photo which feels much more intentional for the viewer when they look at it. So other than that, things like the use of color are really good. There is a little bit of highlight blowing out, but honestly, for this subject and this setting, I don't think that's an issue at all. I think there's a whole lot of really good instincts at play in the way that this photo was created. And then our last photo before the before the honorable mentions rather, comes from Alexa D. And we have a photo here of someone, and everything that we're getting from this photo is coming from the eyes, because we have no other facial expression to pull from here. And this is a really interesting use of eye expression in a photo. Like, is he smiling? Is he like, don't take my photo with the mask on? Things like that. It looks like a happy expression coming from him. Also here, we have a really neat use of light and dark, because there's very little mid-tone here. Only in his skin do we see any mid-tones. And maybe a little bit in the collar of his jacket. The background is white and black. His coat is black. And so because we have just those two tonal ends of the spectrum, really, that forces our eyes. Like I've often said in this video and other videos, our eyes go to the brightest thing. Well, this is an example of where they are not going to the brightest thing. They're going to the mid-tone thing, because the mid-tones make up such a small portion of this photo. So really good use of tone in black and white to amplify the subject of this photo here. If there were one thing to think about looking at as a revision, imagine cropping this down to 1 by 1. And so drop the top of this as far as you can to where it's just a bit above his hair. And then if you need to, bring up the bottom just a little bit, because those parts of the photo don't really have anything in them that's contributing to the overall photo. So if you crop those out, then his face would take up more of the overall photo real estate and become an even more dominant part of the photo. And it would also do a lot to balance out how much of the photo is the midtones. And then our eyes as viewers would still go straight to his face. So just a couple of things to think about with that. Our first honorable mention comes from Francesco Coppola, and we have a photo of, just given the fact that we're going to get through all 5 of these, it's 5 different women, we can assume they're models, and that they are all professional models who are doing quite well posing. We have her up against a light with what's probably a thin shade between the outside world and the photo subject, and so that creates a really soft light that's being shown onto the photo from the left. It's pretty darn close to Rembrandt lighting. I think Rembrandt comes in at a 45-degree angle, But what we have here is a really expert level use of crafted lighting in an interior space. Because not only is that shade diffusing the outside lighting, you can see it in the background, there's a bit of a shadow, but it's also really muted. It's not a harsh shadow. And the same thing is true of the shadows on her left side. So I'm guessing that there's probably also a reflector off to the right side of the image, which is bouncing some of the light from the window back and creating that soft shadow on the side of her face and her neck. Really good use of tone throughout. Here we have just a handful of darks and a handful of really bright tones on the underside of her right arm and then in her hair. And most of the rest of this is lingering quite nicely in the middle range of the tonal spectrum. So, lighting is fantastic. Focus is spot on. Composition is pretty darn good. So really a lot of things here going on that are just really spectacular. Our next honorable mention comes from Casey Schmidt, and we have a very striking photo of a black dog on a plain black background. And from a technical perspective, there are really relatively few things in life that are in the life of photography that are going to be harder than this. Black on black is difficult. And this is executed really, really well. In fact, just looking at it, I don't think that black background is artificial. I think that this dog was actually sitting in front of a black background. And in order to achieve this separation of a black dog in front of a black background, that takes a whole lot of really good light use. And you can see what's going on here with this dog in the way that the highlights are shining in its coat and in its eyes. That it looks like there's two lights that are up and back just a little bit of the dog, and you can see that from the highlights in its eyes. And both of them are fairly large, so they're probably strobes with either umbrellas or reflectors. That's my best guess looking at those highlights and the quality and the softness of the light that is shining on the dog's fur. And one of the things that's really going very well with this is how almost symmetrical the patterns of the light in the dog's fur are. There's only a few places where that's different, and that's okay. That really complements the subject well. So as we talked about with the last photo, and as we're going to talk about the next photo, really exceptional use of light crafting with this, and just an expert level use of light in this photo. Our next runner-up comes from Frank Wooters, and we have a portrait of a person on a black background. Again, another hard shot. He's wearing a dark shirt, a dark sweater of some kind, and it's really easy with a photo like this, and you have somebody who is of lighter skin tone, to just completely blow out the textures, or the highlights rather, on the person's face. But we don't have that. And there's also here, so we have another photo that is an exceptional use of lighting and lighting control in this honorable mention group. We also have a lot of really good technical things going on here. You can see that through his glasses, his eyes are in focus again, and also the use of depth of field is spot on. So the very tip of his nose is just a hair in front of the plane of sharpest focus, and that's okay to do for a portrait like this because most people aren't being drawn to the tip of the nose, and having the tip of a nose being in sharp relief can actually become a distracting element, especially if the person has something like discoloration or pores or whatever, right? And then so the plane of sharpest focus starts maybe halfway back on his nose because you can see his glasses are in sharp focus, and then ends right about the middle of his ear. And so you can see sort of like that the hearing aids coming out of his ear transition into out of focus. So the depth of field on this is perfect. Like, this is a textbook. Here is what depth of field on a shoulder up portrait photo should look like. So that's really well done as well. The lighting in this one is a little bit more harsh than we saw in the others, and you can see that because there are a couple of places where under his right eye where the highlights are blown out. But generally, the lighting is still really well controlled. Oh, and you can also see in the shadows cast by his glasses that it's a slightly the lighting is harsher. Now, what do we mean by harsher? In if you think of a laser, it aligns all the photons, very harsh light. If you stick something in front of that laser beam and it's, it'll cast a crisp shadow. And so harsh light is one where the beams of light are more in line. And so when they create a shadow on whatever is blocking the light creates a shadow, those shadows then are more well-defined. And if you think back, especially at Francesco's photo, there were shadows and they were very diffuse. And here we have the only shadow information we really have that's highlighting that is the glasses, because they're casting a fine line along his face. I mean, that is such an insignificant quibble for what is the rest of this photo just being absolutely perfectly executed, and really a fantastic example of a studio portrait, which means we now have two people who are wondering where they've placed. We're going to jump in here to Stephen Boski's photo of a singer. And man, I remember when he sent me this photo, Stephen was one of the first people to send in entries, as he often is. And he sent me this photo. I'm just like, oh, that I can tell you right now that's going to be the one to beat. And it is really stunningly well executed. So this is one where we have an environmental photo of the singer, and a really lovely use of color, because the singer is either cast in light, which is red, or more likely looks like he's wearing some stage makeup, which has turned his skin and his lips a little bit warm tone. And then he's got this really old retro style microphone that is just gray, cool metal. And then behind him, you have this blue cast of light, which amplifies the warm tones in his skin tone. And then those are reflected, not reflected, that's not the right word. Those are echoed in the warm tones in the bottom left quarter of the image, and then in his tie as well. So there's a consistent color palette throughout this image of warm tones in opposition to cool tones. So really neat use of color in this, and a really good use of setting and showing the engagement of the singer in the setting. A couple of other things that are going on here that I think are neat image elements are the way that the light is casting its specular source point lights. Now, there's a couple things that tells us. So one of the things that this tells us is that this photo is probably not the easiest one to get spot on, because this photo was shot wide open. If you look at the cat's eyes in the upper left, those are projections of the circle of the entry pupil on the upper of the corner of the negative, or this is a film shot. And so as your circular beam cast by the entry pupil shifts towards the corners, it changes into an oval or cat's eye shape. And so that the evenness of those ovals tells us that this was shot wide open. If it was shot stop down, those would have some sort of texture along the perimeters, or even perhaps an unevenness. One side would be like kind of blob shaped, and the other one would take on the shape of the aperture. And those would then become a little bit more distracting. And then those shapes are again reflected in the specular highlights of what looks like a guitar in the lower left corner. And because of then the darkness on the right side of the photo, what we have is a subject who doesn't feel centrally composed, even though he's pretty darn close to centrally composed. And we get more of a sense of this out of focus area behind him that is very musical in nature. And so without seeing any details of the scene, we get a good sense of it as well. And this is just like across the board, a photo which really worked stunningly well. And so one person now knows who is going to get the top spot, the coveted golden Neener for this category, and it is Antonio King, taking a textbook example of a scene portrait, right? And so everything here is really working well. Like, you could look at this and say the text is maybe a little bit distracting over on the wall. Not really, because it's part of the setting. Well, the hoses in this are maybe, no, because they're part of the setting. And what this this photo is telling us is a story about the subject, this guy who's working a physical blue-collar job. I mean, look at, like, the wrench. I'm not even certain I could lift that wrench. And he's just got it over his shoulders. And his pose and his setting tell us a whole lot about the dude who's in this photo, that this is his life. And he does this day in, day out, and this is a part of him. There is so much about this photo that tells a story about the subject, the human in it, and does so exceptionally well. And as we've talked about with Antonio's work throughout this whole series this year, all of it, from a technical perspective, is executed spot on. And once again, I think this might be the fourth of 4 times I've said this in the series. If I had taken this photo, it would definitely have been one of my best of the year. It's a remarkably strong photo. So, yeah, absolutely beautiful work on this Antonio. So with that, we are done with the portrait category. Next up, we will take a look at black and white tomorrow, and then we will end this series with the portfolio judging. See you guys tomorrow.